In today's Sunday school lesson, as well as next week's, I'll be setting up the story of Noah's flood, and we'll begin by reading Genesis chapter 5. You're about to be subjected to a toledoth, and so am I, so bear with me. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them humankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness according to his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. Seth lived after the birth of Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. Enosh lived after the birth of Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. Kenan lived after the birth of Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. Mahalalel lived after the birth of Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. Jared lived after the birth of Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. Methuselah lived after the birth of Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he became the father of a son. He named him Noah, saying, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands." Lamech lived after the birth of Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sorry to put you through all that, but it is, after all, according to those who molded my young mind, sacred history. Color me skeptical. What we have in chapter 5 is a toledoth, a list of generations meant to bridge the time between two noteworthy events. The Bible is well supplied with such toledoths, with a couple of them in the New Testament Gospels of Matthew and Luke. There are a number of toledoths provided in the book of Genesis, and in this case, the events that are bridged by this priestly book of generations are the creation and the flood of Noah. Such passages are not exactly the juiciest reading in the sacred scriptures. Even though I read the Bible regularly when I was a teenager, I usually just skipped those because, although I knew I was reading the Word of God, I figured memorizing those lists probably wouldn't assist me in working out my salvation with fear and trembling as I had been instructed to do. Let's see if we can pull some meat off these repetitively articulated bones. If I added correctly, the flood seems to have happened 1,656 years after the creation of Adam. Between Adam and Noah inclusive, up to the time of the birth of Noah's 3 sons, there are 10 generations, with an average of 155.6 years per generation. With the single exception of Noah, every one of these patriarchs is said to have sired other sons and daughters, in addition to the one son documented to trace the genealogy. Presumably all of those long-lived kids would themselves have been busy making other long-lived kids until the world must have been absolutely crawling with sinful human scum before God finally got a cosmic gutful and decided to wipe them all out, which is, of course, something that the creator of the electromagnetic force would do. With the exception of Eve, not a single one of these patriarchs' wives had a name that has come down to us, and that is true also of the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This story is looking mighty patriarchal. Of course, that patriarchal slant is embedded in the very language of the sacred scriptures, as is evident from verse 1 of this chapter, where the narrative has switched back to the language of Genesis 1, with God creating humankind in his image. Of course, I'm quoting here the language of the New Revised Standard Version, which views the use of Adam in verse 1 as representative of all humanity, male and female. But in fact, the word does mean and always has meant man with its patriarchal implications. And it is translated that way in versions of the Bible that are now considered archaic, but which in their way, I refer especially to the King James Version, probably captured the flavor of the original text better than this more inclusive language, laudable though it is. It seems notable to me that Adam's son Seth is made in turn in his likeness. So that divine template is now being passed down through the generations. Funny, I don't recall seeing that said of any of Cain's descendants. I won't belabor most of these generations, as the good book really gives us very little to gnaw on, but I'll focus on a couple of the luminaries. One is Enoch, son of Jared and father of Methuselah, and not to be confused with Enoch, son of Cain and father of Irad, whom we met last week in chapter 4, and in whose name the first city was built. In the case of Seth's great-great-great-grandson Enoch, we have a great mystery. After a mere 365 years of life, this godly man was apparently raptured, sucked up into paradise intact. According to the author of the anonymous New Testament epistle to the Hebrews, Enoch was one of the 3 great antediluvian exemplars of faith, along with Abel and Noah. In chapter 11, the celebrated faith chapter, we read this about him. By faith Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For it was attested before he was taken away that he had pleased God. Actually, the Genesis text says he walked with God, but I guess it comes to the same thing. In the strange little epistle of Jude, after describing a host of miscreants, malefactors, malcontents, and misanthropes, Jude informs us that it was also about these that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, "See, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones." Enoch is thus the first person credited by the Christian Bible with prophetic powers. This was not lost on the theological luminaries who warped my young mind in thrice weekly services at my parents' cult of choice. In the much salivated over book of Revelation, there's an account of 2 witnesses who play a critical role in the unfolding apocalypse. "And I will grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut the sky so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, members of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets had been a torment to the inhabitants of the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and those who saw them were terrified. Now, I spent a lot of time in my tender years around people who were obsessed with the prophecies in the book of Revelation and studied it constantly along with the rest of the Bible, trying thereby to discern the future. This is one of the stories about which there was a great deal of lively debate. Who are these 2 witnesses? Some of the more abstract-minded suggested that they were the Bible and the Holy Spirit, while the more literal-minded saw Enoch and Elijah, for they are the only 2 people ever taken directly to heaven without dying. Apologists for the latter view pointed out that since the 2 witnesses must be killed by the Antichrist, the only people in sacred history who could thus be terminated without suffering the dread second death mentioned in several other places in that bizarre book were Enoch and Elijah. And according to all the best authorities, Enoch and Elijah were both prophets. Anyway, it's a knotty problem, apparently very difficult, and I guess we should all be grateful they've got good people working on it. By which I actually mean, can you imagine all the brain power that's been squandered over the last 2,000 years trying to parse opaque nonsense like this? Enoch, this is hard to get through. Enoch was, of course, the father of Methuselah, who, dying at age... Sorry, this is tough. Enoch was, of course, the father of Methuselah, who, dying at 969 years of age, holds the world's record for longevity. Methuselah was, in turn, the grandfather of Noah, and Noah's flood serendipitously happened the very year of Methuselah's death. Did he drown? One of the puffed-up Bible scholars around whom I hung when I was in my late teens informed me that the name Methuselah means, "When I die, it shall come." I often find interesting stuff on ChristianAnswers.net, so I looked up the patriarch's name there and found this. The exact meaning of this very ancient name is somewhat uncertain. Dr. Henry Morris said it may mean, "When he dies, judgment." Others say, "When he is dead, it shall be sent." It refers to the deluge. This ancient righteous man lived before the flood and died at the age of 969 years in the year of the flood and before it began. The 2 biblical references cited here are in Genesis 5, which I just read, and 1 Chronicles, where his name is mentioned in another toledoth without another word about him. This fact, plus the former possible meaning of his name, suggests that Methuselah's very godly father, Enoch, received a prophecy from God when his son was born, thus the name. Methuselah's great age may be further evidence of God's long suffering in the days of Noah. Here there are citations from 1st and 2nd Peter. I want to focus on that one phrase, "and died at the age of 969 years in the year of the flood and before it began." I have combed this text every way I know how, and I find no indication whatsoever that Methuselah died before it began. I smell a rat here. I'll bet the old fart drowned, and Christians are covering it up. Check out what Noah's father said about him. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he became the father of a son. He named him Noah, saying, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands." The name Noah apparently means rest, repose. What a nice sentiment. The prophecy isn't much more specific than that. Various Christian sects have constructed fantastic edifices of prophetic interpretation. Indeed, that is one of the main reasons for the frequent rifts in fundamentalist groups, resulting in a plethora of barely distinguishable denominations that are regularly at each other's throats. When I was growing up, I regularly heard heated debates over whether the rapture would be pre-tribulation or mid-tribulation, and I know of at least one local association that was led by the most influential pastor of that loose-knit group to leave the fold and start a new association of fundamentalist Baptists that are, to the eyes of outsiders, no more different from the others than H2O and water. Hey, Polly. You enjoying Sunday school, dear? I regularly heard sermons on prophetic topics from the bloviator who defiled his own sacred text Sunday after Sunday, and I recall that in a series on fulfilled prophecies in the Bible, those obscure predictions buried in the names of Methuselah and Noah were trotted out as glowing examples of such. This is what it's like to live with cats, and oh my God, do I love it. I remember thinking that the prediction embedded in Methuselah's name seemed a lot more solid in terms of serious prognostication than those anodyne words about Noah. Exactly how did Noah bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands? This chapter concludes with, "After Noah was 500 years old, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth." I'm not going to take it any farther today. Even though I indicated last week that I intended to trace the whole sorry story of human history from Shem to the flood in this lesson, this has already become longer than I originally envisioned, so I'm going to leave the juicy details in the first 8 verses of the next chapter for next week. There's a lot to unpack there, including some hanky-panky between the sons of God and the daughters of men, to say nothing of Nephilim. Once the Nephilim move in, there goes the neighborhood.